The word Doppel is German for the English word double. Ganger translates to English as walker or goer. Doppelganger or Doublewalker refers to paranormal beings that are an exact copy of a living person. These doppelgangers are almost always such a precise copy of the original that loved ones and friends are usually not aware that they are looking at an imposter. The one noticeable difference that witnesses who interact with a doppelganger sometimes claim to notice is that the being seems to be off in some ways, often saying very little and having a strange way about them. Encounters with doppelgangers go back to at least as far as the 1600s, when Queen Elizabeth I of England claimed to see her dead double lying in her bed. This experience disturbed the ruler badly. She would go on to share her experience with others. The normally rational ruler was quite frightened by her run-in with her dead duplicate, perhaps with good reason, because Elizabeth would not live long after this encounter, dying at just 45 years of age. The nature of these beings is unknown, but theories about their existence have been put forth. Some believe the doppelganger is actually a demon or a spirit that uses its supernatural abilities to mimic its victims. Other legends claim that the creature is an omnipresent twin spirit that each person has from the day they are born. Although they are rarely witnessed by the host, if such a sighting does occur, it is a bad omen that is said to precede misfortune or even death. Others believe that doppelgangers are actually some form of expression of a person's psyche or spirit that they subconsciously can manifest into the physical world. There are numerous accounts where people claim to have witnessed their own duplicate or that of a friend or loved one. We will now go over just 3 chilling tales of doppelganger encounters that are said to be true. Our first story takes us back to the year 1845. Emily Segi was a school teacher in Latvia at the time. Reportedly, all of her co-workers considered her dependable and effective as a teacher, but there were questions why she had switched jobs so frequently, having taught at 19 different schools over 16 years. The reason for her constant job movement may have become clear to her new employers when people at the school would begin seeing the popular teacher in 2 places at the same time. In one instance, Miss Segi was teaching French class when a twin version of herself appeared next to her at the chalkboard in front of a startled classroom. The doppelganger looked exactly like Emily, right down to the clothing, and would mimic each move she made. The frightened students tried to bring the strange duplicate to her attention, but the teacher was unable to see her twin, although it looked perfectly like an exact living duplicate standing right next to her. More eyewitness accounts would take place at the school, including ones where Emily would be in one location and her doppelganger would be in another at the exact same time. Miss Segi would be seen roaming the school halls often, but at the same time would be known to be sound asleep in her office. In one eerie situation, students watched Miss Segi's double sit silent before them during a sewing class, not seemingly aware that it was her duplicate until one student looked out the classroom window. There they would see the real Emily outside working in the garden. Hundreds of students would go on to claim they had seen Segi's doppelganger, causing a panic at the school. The parents were afraid to send their children to the school, and eventually they were forced to let the teacher go because of this. For the unfortunate Emily Segi, she may have lost her job, but she would never herself witness her doppelganger, despite all the eyewitness accounts. Perhaps this was for the best, because seeing your own doppelganger was considered an ill omen by many. Our second story comes from one victim's account about the time they had a very long and strange encounter with their friend's doppelganger. The story began with a group of men in their late 20s who had known each other since kindergarten. The encounter took place within the last couple of years, when the group of friends made plans to meet at a country home one of them owned, for a weekend getaway. This was apparently a common thing for the now grown men, a chance to get away from civilization and play video games and reconnect. All of the men were in long-term relationships and would bring their significant others along with them for these getaways. Recently, one of the friends, named Andy, had went through a difficult divorce at the time. Andy's mother was also dying of cancer. The other friends were concerned about him because of all of this. When they invited Andy to come along for the getaway, he stated he did not want to go because of the awkwardness that he would face being the only one there alone, while everyone else there brought their significant others. Although the concerned friends tried to convince Andy to come along, they all understood when he resisted and decided to let the issue be. On the Saturday morning, when one of the friends was set to leave for the getaway, he decided to call Andy to see if he could convince him to come along one last time. Andy would answer the call, but sound strange during the conversation, speaking sluggish and not being very responsive. When Andy's friend asked him if he would reconsider coming along for the getaway, Andy only replied with an "okay." The calling friend thought that perhaps Andy was mad because he had not laughed and talked very little during the phone conversation. After Andy agreed to come along, the friend told Andy that his wife and he would pick him up in front of his house and give him a ride to the retreat. From the moment Andy got into the car, things seemed to not be quite right. Andy seemed slow or incapacitated. He did not laugh at any jokes and had trouble responding to simple questions. His only response would be yes, no, or a strange, slurred, short phrase. Andy's friends began to think that perhaps his difficult personal situation had led him to start using drugs. The friend would ask Andy repeatedly if he was alright, but Andy would not acknowledge that anything was wrong. After an hour of driving, the strange ride with Andy was over, and the trio arrived at the country house. The group of friends were in good spirits and ready to reconnect at the country house with a weekend of food, drinks, and games. From the beginning, Andy's strange behavior became obvious to the party. He wasn't playing any games or talking to the group. He just spent the entire time watching the other friends who were staring off through the window into the distance. The entire time Andy had an expression on his face as if he was in awe of everything or watching something very impressive taking place. As the day turned to night, the friends noticed that he had not eaten or drank a thing the entire time. One of Andy's friends would later claim that Andy also had not used the bathroom for his entire stay. The friends would prod him to talk, but Andy would only respond with an "I'm okay." Eventually the friends all just decided to let him be and quit trying to get him to engage them. As the night went on, Andy would depart from the party and go sit on a bench outside. There he sat and stared off into a stretch of woods while the other friends stayed inside enjoying themselves. When it came time for everyone to go to sleep, Andy was still strangely staring off into the distance while sitting still alone on the bench in the darkness. They urged him to go to bed, but he said he wanted to stay where he was just a bit longer. When the friends awoke in the morning, they would see Andy was not in his room and his bed was still made. They discovered he was sitting outside on the bench in the exact same position they had last seen him. The group of friends were at this point all very unnerved by Andy's behavior. The concerned and weirded out group of friends decided that it was time to end the weekend retreat and take Andy back home. The same two friends that had picked Andy up would take him back to his home, dropping him off, with Andy continuing to behave oddly the entire ride. Later that evening, some of the group of friends would happen upon each other at a local restaurant for a birthday party of a common friend. Surprisingly, Andy was there, but he seemed to be nothing like the person they had just dropped off hours before. His spirits were high, and he was talking normally. The friends that had just witnessed his odd behavior earlier were confused. One of them approached Andy and asked him what had happened earlier. Andy replied that his car had broken down and that one of his friends had to pick him up in the middle of the night after leaving the bar. The confused friend could not make sense of this reply. He asked again what Andy was referring to and how his story of being at a bar the previous night could even be possible. Panic began to grow through the group of friends when two other people said they had been with Andy at the bar the night before. They were even able to show pictures of Andy there at the time. Andy's terrified friends knew he had been with them in the country, but also had to accept that he was also at the bar at the same instance. When Andy realized his friends weren't joking about what had happened, he too began to get scared. Looking at Andy's phone history, they were able to confirm he had been called by the friend who had picked him up the morning before, but Andy could not remember answering it. The group would try to figure out what had happened that night, but would not be able to come up with any explanation. As time would pass, Andy's friends would become very afraid of him and what his true identity was. They were never able to figure out who they spent the night with at the country home. The friends would ask Andy about the situation from time to time, trying to achieve some sense of closure, but this would eventually begin to get him angry, and he would quit talking about the situation. Andy's friends would begin to withdraw from him too, while Andy himself would eventually come to the conclusion that they were all confused and had imagined the entire thing. Eventually, with no answers available, the witnesses of Andy's doppelganger would become more nervous and terrified about that night, and will rarely, if ever, speak about the incident. With Emily Sagi, we heard a story of a woman who seemingly could project her being at two places at one time. While in the case of Andy, there seemed to be some strange mimic who took his place, but seemed to be an eerie observer that behaved completely different to the person he cloned. In our final brief story, we discussed a more malevolent version of the doppelganger, one whose complete purpose was to do nothing more than cause terror in its victim. This witness account begins with two young children playing in their backyard. The siblings were playing a game of hide-and-go-seek. The younger, a 10-year-old boy, covered his eyes and began to count while his older sister ran off to find a place to hide. After he was finished counting, the boy began to look for his hidden sister. The young boy was astounded when he looked up at his family's nearby garage. There on the roof, crouching above him, was his sister. She was staring at the boy with a strange grin on her face. The boy could not figure out how she had gotten on the roof. There was no means to get there, and she was somehow able to get into her perch in only a few short seconds. The young boy began to yell at his older sister to come down, but she would just crouch there with a huge grin on her face, not moving, while staring at him intently. Suddenly he heard a familiar voice from off in the distance. "Who are you talking to?" He turned to see his sister on the other side of the yard, looking at him confused. The startled boy looked back to the roof of the garage and saw no one was there. The frightened child would share his story with few believing what he saw. The strange experience would grow even more frightening when it would become known that the old garage had been rebuilt after burning down many years prior. During the fire, someone had died within the garage. The witness is still terrified about what he saw in the garage that day. As with most paranormal legends, there is often little evidence to verify their existence, but the stories of witnesses. The sheer number of accounts over the years about doppelgangers may make one question whether there is any substance to their legend. If such beings do exist, one could imagine what a mind-bending and terrifying experience a run-in with one would be like. Perhaps the most disturbing factor is that there is no way to know their purpose. By the being's very nature, one could surmise that it wishes to trick us into believing it is a trusted friend or loved one. What the Doublewalker wishes to achieve through his deceptive behavior is impossible to know, but it is clear they almost always cause fear, anxiety, and a warping of reality to their victims. What we do know is that the Doppelganger is one of the most sinister beings known, real or imagined.